So do we have anyone online?
Yeah.
We do?
We do have about 15 people actually.
About 15 people. Okay, great. I'm gonna start. Oops, how was I advancing this before? Sorry, technical learning the room. I wanted to start just by acknowledging the huge number of people who contributed to the Vermont Climate Assessment. So we have leadership from myself, Josh Faulkner, Leslie Ann DePigny-Giroux, and Stephen Posner. Laura Edling led our needs assessment, which was engagement with over 100 stakeholders across Vermont that she talked to about the types of information and the forms of information that people needed about climate change and making local scale decisions in Vermont. And then there's a long list of the authors who led each chapter. And many of these lead authors recruited other authors to help them with the chapters, many of them working in NGOs, state agencies, and other programs around the state of Vermont. So we had a number of stakeholders. We had lots of volunteer authors. We had people who were volunteer reviewers, subject matter experts who provided feedback on these chapters, and then who actually wrote certain sections of them. I was asking about who was online because I know a number of these authors are joining us online. I can't see the full list of people who's here, but during Q&A, I might punt some questions to those authors if they're really specific on agriculture, forests, or so on. So I'm here sort of as the representative for the Vermont Climate Assessment, but I really want to emphasize that this was a huge labor of love, really, from a very big group of people. So it couldn't have been done without them. Today, I want to talk a little bit about state climate assessments, which I think are fairly unique, and they're definitely unique when we come at them from the Vermont perspective. So that is a fairly small state with not necessarily the resources of a state like California, but also therefore the ability to be a little bit more nimble and reactive when we're presented with information. I put up here some of the key messages. So these are kind of themes that we'll run through the talk today, and I'm going to kind of focus on some vignettes and examples, the types of things that we get a lot of questions about, but these are the themes that you'll see kind of appearing through all these stories. So climate change is here, it's happening in Vermont. Vermont's getting warmer, it's getting wetter, and there's super complex impacts of climate change. It's not just this happens and this is the response, but there's this deep interconnectedness among our ecology, our physical environment, and our humans' health and well-being. And then we're sort of on this upward trajectory. So we will continue on that trajectory unless changes come. So I'll repeat kind of these themes throughout the talk. I want to give you some examples. What's happening to snowfall, what's happening to rainfall, but also what they mean in terms of these complex interactions and impacts on our ecosystems, our human environments, and so on. So you all came to this gun talk. I'm going to assume you already think a lot about climate change in some context of your work. This is grabbed from the National Climate Assessment, and these are the types of graphs we see a lot representing long-term climate change. So thinking about how things have changed perhaps over the last 100 years, and sometimes these graphs go out another 100 years. They give us a really good sense of what's happening globally, what the causes are, and so on. And then we dig into things like the National Climate Assessment, and we get these really useful maps. So on a national scale, these types of maps convey to us differences among different regions in the country. I particularly like the figures on the right side. So the upper right shows the change in heavy rainfall from 1950 to 1916. And you can see the northeastern United States, we've increased by 55%. So our number of heavy precipitation days in our region is really high. And you can contrast that, say, with the Southwest, where that number or that trend is different, right? So this helps inform national understanding and priorities about addressing climate change, right? It gives us these really regional contexts. On the bottom, we have projections going out into the future. Again, the Northeast is lit up in this deep blue color, showing very intense changes. So this is really important context and really helpful information. I don't want to say it's not useful, but if you're like me, your eyes might zoom in on the state of Vermont. And then you'd say, well, gosh, I live in Vermont, and I know where I live is very different than where some of my friends in another part of the state live. So painting us all one color blue is maybe simplifying the reality of our own context. And to me, that's really where state level or local level assessments like the Scale of Vermont come in. We can go from these global or national contexts to understanding a little bit more nuance within our own setting. So that's the importance, I think, of these climate assessments. And the people who really want that information are folks like yourself, because you're here today listening to me talk about it. But people who are making decisions all the time. And I'll try and give some examples throughout the talk of people who need decision support information around climate change, where this might not meet their needs to make a big decision, say a financial investment decision in infrastructure, but something a little bit more tuned to their backyard is helpful. So we try and inform many different types of decision makers, and this could be an everyday citizen, this could be a member of the state legislature, this could be a regional planner, this could be a farmer, it could be a number of different people. I personally don't try and reach out to every person in the state of Vermont. This is a sort of a fun, more academic representation of what we do. So a number of us interface with national researchers on climate change. We have this box that sort of the authors of the Vermont Climate Assessment sit in, and we interact with who I'm calling knowledge brokers. So these are a type of stakeholder, but they tend to be people who represent a very large group of stakeholders or have a particular voice with a large group of stakeholders. So one example would be, Gillian trying to go around and talk to every person in Vermont or get in the ear of every person in Vermont about climate change. It's probably not going to happen. But we work with people, for example, in the National Weather Service, who get invited to talk about climate change and hazard mitigation with the Emergency Managers Association of Vermont, which has about 100 members that represent towns and different districts across Vermont. So the National Weather Service can use our slides, can use our information. They have helped us actually generate that information. They've given us feedback in the process, the design, the selection of information, and then they're taking the products that come out of it and communicating it with their stakeholders on the ground. So that's what we mean by knowledge brokers. Oftentimes that could be people in state agencies and so on who are looking for climate change resources specific to Vermont. So that's kind of how we go about this. I mentioned the needs assessment process. So Laura Edling led that. And she talked to, as I said, over 100 knowledge brokers around Vermont to get their input in terms of the topics that are of interest to them, as well as the formats in which they want to receive the information. Okay, I want to dive right in. This is a recent chart actually that came out after the Vermont Climate Assessment. So it came out just last month. It's from the Vermont State Climate Summary. So these state climate summaries were done for every state in the country. You'll notice Leslie Ann Dubigny-Giroux from UVM here was a co-author on this. And what they're showing is the historical trend in Vermont's climate. So here we're looking at the change in temperature from the long-term average, and the orange line is the observed. And these sort of envelopes or fuzzy regions, I'll call them, are representing climate models. So these are different models or different model parameterizations that sort of express some of the uncertainty. So we capture the historical period, or they capture the historical period fairly well. And depending on future global emissions, we're on this higher emissions trajectory or this lower emissions trajectory. But you can see that we're sort of heading in this future that is quite a bit warmer for Vermont, even in the lower emissions scenario. So this type of information I think is really helpful in understanding sort of the big picture, where we're coming from in Vermont and what things look like in the future. And then I'm going to start presenting some of the data that was analyzed for the Vermont Climate Assessment, specifically to convey some of the nuances. So to start moving away from this really long-term picture and thinking a little bit more about trends, and trends in particular, climate patterns that affect us and affect our lives. So these stations, and I'd like to give out a shout out to Mahalia, who's sitting here. If you see Crosset and Clark, that's Mahalia Clark. I don't know if Caitlin's online, but if she is, hi Caitlin. So these are the stations that Mahalia and Caitlin analyzed across the state of Vermont. So the goal was to get a good geographical representation and use stations that were rated by the National Weather Service to have good quality or reliable data. So a lot of these stations, very interesting story, are actually humans, right? They're a person who's responsible for a particular station. They're called a co-op observer. They record the data from these weather stations and submit it, most of them online, but some of them still in a paper form, to the National Weather Service. So we sat down with folks from the Burlington office and actually went station by station to determine which ones had a good period of record, good quality data, and would give us sort of a broad spatial coverage. I will point out that there's 3 regions. So this was split into northeastern Vermont, western Vermont, and southeastern Vermont. And if you live in Vermont, you'll notice that there are some places like Mount Mansfield or the Northfield site that are at a little bit higher elevation, Sports Falls. So there's geographic variation within these. In some graphs, we've broken the data up by region, and in some of them, we've clumped all the stations together. So I'll point that out later just to give you a little way to sort of think critically about what we're representing in the data. Okay, so let's look at some of the data. I put the thumbnail of that map up there. These are annual averages. So this is the annual average temperature in Vermont in the black line. The blue line is the winter annual average, and the summer annual average is on the top. Again, these are all the stations in Vermont lumped in together and put into this really long-term average. So there isn't a super clear trend, right? Like it's maybe not as pronounced as you would have thought from the first graph I showed you with the modeled scenarios of future change. Another thing that might catch your eye if you're really a critical observer is that sort of the shading or the variability around the solid lines increases over time. And I believe it was Caitlin pointed out that a number of stations came online, I think it was around 1940, including the Mount Mansfield site. So all of a sudden we've started taking this average and incorporating things like a more mountainous, a colder station versus the Burlington station, for example. So great to look at these big state averages and trends, but I think it gets, the more we slice and dice the data and actually think about parameters that really mean something to us, it gets more useful. And Caitlin and Mahalia did a really amazing job thinking about how to analyze the data and how to communicate it in ways that were very simple and straightforward. So for example, breaking up the seasons, what's happening in the winter? We're just coming out of winter, but the take-home message is less cold nights and more warm days. So cold nights are temperatures below 0. So these are extreme colds. And this isn't our extreme cold, number of cold days. I said that wrong. But the point is that these are the types of days of the year that help us keep snow on the ground. They're not the type of weather that we've experienced this week. And then warm nights in the winter too. So cold nights in the winter keep our snow on the ground. It can be a little bit above freezing during the day, but as long as we're getting the overnight cooling, we stay cool, we keep snow on the ground, and it helps us make more snow. It helps the weather provide more snow to us. So these trends clearly, when they're above the black line, it's showing an increase from the long-term average, and when they're below the black line, it's showing a decrease from the long-term average. So as we move through time, we're getting less cold days and more warm nights in the winter. Why do we care? This is a nice piece put together by Josh Morse, who is very passionate about white-tailed deer. White-tailed deer are a beloved species in Vermont, but they are sort of representative of the management challenges we have coming down the pipeline with climate change. So currently, deer populations in Vermont are limited by winter intensity, and they're also well managed by hunting. So in the future, warming in our climate, like those trends we saw in the last slide, are likely to boost the population of our deer herd. And that puts a lot of pressure on our forests, particularly forest regeneration. And in fact, if you talk to a forester like Jess about say upstate New York, where their deer herd is not well controlled in terms of its population numbers, the deer herd actually does really significant damage to the forest, more so than any other factor on the forests of New York. So in Vermont, we're in a good place, but the future is kind of telling us, hey, in the future, we may have more deer. This could be a big problem on our forest ecosystems. But there are some really interesting opportunities. And COVID presented actually a cool opportunity to see how people might change their habits. So during COVID, the number of people registering for hunting licenses went way up. And that was true for fishing licenses. It was true for a number of other things. There's also a lot of organizations in Vermont and around the country that are promoting participation in hunting by younger populations, which traditionally are not a huge part of the demographic, or currently are not. There's a movement towards increasing participation by BIPOC people in activities like hunting, and organizations to support that and make that happen. And Josh has done some social science work looking at people's interest or willingness perhaps to hunt in the future. So there's this interesting social aspect, right? Like thinking about how people will react, how our norms, our leisure activities and so on may actually interact with climate change. So it's not to say deer are going to increase, our forests are at peril, but there may actually be a societal response that helps us manage that particular climate change impact. Okay, summer nights not cooling off. When I first moved to Vermont, I remember having a few very hot summer nights when I was first here, and sort of the amazement that most houses were not really equipped for that, whether it's air conditioning or even just the way they're constructed is not really meant to promote cooling for these hot nights. So hot nights are nights when the temperature gets above 70 degrees. I think we get a lot of like 68-degree nights on warm summers, but as you can see, the number of days per year that experience these hot nights is increasing over the decades. So why does that matter? Well, when you lay out in bed not sleeping because you're hot, particularly if you're an elderly person or coming from a vulnerable population, it increases your heat stress and the likelihood that you'll visit the emergency department. So this is data actually pulled, I think, from Caitlin and Mahalia's climate chapter, and then emergency department visits by Vermonters. So this includes data from hospitals outside of Vermont, but where a Vermonter visited them due to heat stress. So you can see they're pretty highly correlated and move in pretty close lockstep. So sorry, we jumped to hot days here instead of hot nights. But the idea is very, very much the same. And the state is paying attention to this. So this is a heat vulnerability assessment for the state of Vermont by the health department. And they're considering a number of factors here, but there are clear geographic disparities in terms of who's vulnerable to these heat stress events. So the green colors are low vulnerability and the brown colors are high vulnerability. So there's a definite geography to these trends, which is really interesting. And humans are not the only ones who suffer. Does anyone like to fly fish? Anyone fish for brook trout? Not many fly fishers in the room. So interestingly enough, anglers have a pretty big economic impact in Vermont. Sales of things, purchases they make, lodging, fuel, so on, when they're in the state, accounts for about $150 million per year. 16 million of that is tax revenue, and it's estimated to create almost well over 2,000 jobs. So an economic component, not just a leisure activity, or perhaps you could say some of both. I picked brook trout because they're a beautiful fish. Vermont is very well known for having beautiful brook trout populations and being a destination for brook trout fishing. Brook trout they like cold water. They like temperatures near freezing to about 65 degrees. And they will tolerate brief periods of water temperatures up to about 72 degrees, but even exposed for a few hours to temperatures of 75-degree water will cause mortality. So, not a lot of heating can have a really big impact And this is just one specific example. Okay, I also, when I showed you the trends across the entire state, those first lines that were red, black, blue, I said there's kind of some problems with averages sometimes, or I feel like the average doesn't always tell the whole story. And the other risk I think we run is we live in Vermont. We have actually a pretty rich history of data in terms of our climate, but sometimes these long-term trends can actually miss recent changes. And so this is one of my favorite examples of that. This is looking at summer minimum temperature. This is a station in Northfield that happens to go back to 1887. So it's really tempting as we work with data to say, oh my gosh, we have this long record, let's use all of it and let's fit a trend line to it. Well, the trend line doesn't tell you very much. It looks fairly flat. But if I asked you to tell me what's happened since about 1975, I think the story would be very different than if you focus on the entire period. And what I'm referring to is actually that very steep increase in the last 3 or 4 decades in this particular parameter, so the summer minimum temperature. So the long-term record, sometimes if we're just looking at an average or a change in average, we're actually missing really rapid changes that may be occurring more recently. I also like to think about what we think about in the future. So I showed you a graph that showed future climate change in Vermont out to 2100 under high emissions and low emissions scenarios. The typical person, myself included, have a really hard time envisioning life in 2100. Maybe we can think about 2030. Some of you are probably thinking about like 2023 when you graduate. So maybe 2030 even seems hard to think about. 2040, 2050 seem hard to think about. But they're a little bit closer to home, a little bit easier to understand than 2100. And when we think in that near term, the 1 decade, 2 decades, 3 decades, the patterns that we've seen over the last decade, 2 or 3 decades are really good estimates of the trajectory we're on, at least for the next 10 years, maybe 20 years. And we might accelerate up or down from that a little bit, but it's a good indicator of the future. So when I look at this line, I think about, okay, you could project this blue trend line, that sort of projection from the average out 10 or 20 years, but you'd probably be really far off from what is actually going to happen over the next 10 or 20 years. And the trend line over, say, 1970 to the present may actually be a better representation of them. And why does that matter? When we're thinking about future change, we're thinking again about out towards 2100 as being kind of hard to conceive of, and knowing that a lot of things can change between now and then. But when we start thinking about 2025 and 2050, things become more real. So this is some work by the National Audubon Society that they provided to us to understand the context of Vermont. And they've done this for a number of bird species across the nation. But the Vermont Audubon in particular suggested that we focus on a few bird species that are important in Vermont. I pulled out the hermit thrush here, but I also like to talk a lot about the common loon. The common loon is a success story because a lot of its habitat has been restored in Vermont. I look at my son, he has a little stuffed animal of a loon. He's 2 years old. He loves loons. And when I see him, I can think about 2050. I have this sense of, in 2050, he's going to be about 30 years old. And the map for the common loon, which I should have put up since I'm telling this story, but it looks fairly similar to the hermit thrush, basically suggests that there may not be habitat that's still suitable for the common loon in Vermont in 2050. Of course, there's some caveats. There's probably places, microclimates, certain conservation measures we can do that might extend that. But when I think about my son, perhaps seeing the common loon disappear off the Vermont landscape, within his lifetime, it becomes a lot more tangible to me. Okay, so maybe that's a little bit of a downer. Let's talk about something going up, an upward trend, more water. So this is annual precipitation, and we started the 1900s around 34, 35 inches of rain per year on average. And I think that's something like Chicago's precipitation. And today we're up in this about 45 inches of rain per year. Again, this is the statewide average, so we're kind of lumping everything together. I grew up in Portland, Oregon. That's more rainfall than we get in Portland, Oregon, right? So we've already shifted our precipitation regime from this sort of like Chicago to like we're beyond Portland or Seattle at 45 inches of rain per year. So big change in precipitation. And what I think is interesting is when you think about how that's happening, it's not a few extra raindrops every time it rains. It's more water coming in really big storms, right? So these heavy rain events, which is the plot on the right. So these are the number of days where we have more than 1 inch of precipitation. Again, this is averaged across the whole state, and it might look slightly different for different regions in Vermont, but overall you can see that we've had a pretty clear increase in these heavy precipitation days. So perhaps no surprise, I like these graphs. They're small, you're not meant to pick up all the details, but the y-axis is the discharge, or the amount of water flowing through the river per unit of time. Each one of these plots is a different river across northern Vermont. And then the dark line in the shading shows you the overall trend and deviation around that. And so the takeaway would be, what is the trend of all of these plots? They're all trending upwards. So all of these are plotted from 1960 to present. So all of that increased precipitation, no surprise, is making its way into Vermont's rivers, streams, and eventually our other water bodies. I think it's really interesting to think about the time of year. Again, don't worry about the details of these tiny little plots, but we now have done it by river and by season. So winter, spring, summer, fall, winter, spring, summer, fall. And I circled the spring plots because those are the ones where it's sort of a mixed bag. Some years there's a lot more discharge, and some years there's less, but every other season is increasing in terms of river discharge. So it's not that we're getting that river swelling just during the winter or just during the summer, but throughout many of the different seasons. And why does this matter? This is from the public health chapter, Stephanie Clement's work. So she pulled the FEMA major disaster declarations in Vermont. So this is by decade, the number of declarations. So a lot of these in Vermont are related to flooding. So we have more water in the rivers, we have more damages and issues around flooding, issues where that water starts to interface with our human environment. This is a plot just focusing on one station for a second. This is the Rutland station. So they were experiencing about 4 or 5 days of heavy precipitation. That's more than 1 inch of rain per year. And that steadily increased over time. If you lived in Vermont in about 2012, when Tropical Storm Irene hit, Rutland was an area that was hit very, very hard. And so this type of graph is actually really useful to people living and working in Rutland who are trying to plan for increased precipitation. I've worked some with the Rutland Regional Planning Commission, and they find this information super useful. They said to me, we thought we needed to upsize our culverts, but when we look at the National Climate Assessment or sources of information like that, it doesn't give us the certainty or the confidence to make those financial outlays. Whereas figures like this that tell them, yes, indeed, you've almost doubled the number of heavy precipitation days in your region, makes them more confident in making those investments. So that was a conversation I had with the Rutland Regional Planning Commission in about 2016. And then oddly, if we update that graph, you see that Rutland has experienced a number of dry spells effectively over the last 8 or 9 years. So they're actually a great example of the climate variability that we're experiencing and expecting more of in Vermont. So we may alternate between these years of very heavy precipitation and then other years like last summer where we were in drought-like conditions for most of the state. Just a quick example, the blue and purple tones here represent where that too much water on the landscape has impacted our agricultural system. And so these are disasters declared by the USDA, so another federal agency that considers disasters. So most of these are related to crops and food production, but most of them in Vermont being related to either too much water or too little water. I had to throw in snow because I always get asked if I don't put it in. It's mixed. We're increasing in precipitation, and right now we're still cold enough to get that precipitation falling as snow in the winter. But we may experience less snowfall going forward, right? We may be in this sweet spot for a while still, where a lot of that precipitation is falling on cold days as snow. But say out past 2050, out towards 2070, we may really see a decrease in snowfall. I wanted to give a shout out to this. These are some of my favorite graphs because I like thinking about the growing season. I like to garden. And if you don't like to garden and you like to ski, you can think about the opposite of this are the frozen days, right? So we have growing days or we have frozen days. They're kind of the same. So our growing days are going up, presenting new opportunities for different crops. One of the ones we highlight in the chapter is saffron. The agricultural chapter also highlights a number of really interesting adaptations to climate change, like seed saving programs and such that are pretty unique to the sort of culture and social fabric of Vermont. I also really wanted to highlight these three plots on your right that Mahalia and Caitlin put together. So we have northeastern Vermont, western Vermont, and southern Vermont, southeastern Vermont, and you can see we're experiencing different trends. And in fact, when we look through most of these climate indicators for Vermont, we see that southeastern Vermont is already more clearly experiencing impacts of climate change because they're more southerly. So they might present a way to think about what's coming for other portions of Vermont down the road. All right. Thank you for your attention and letting me tell you all those stories. And again, I kind of relate back to this. Climate change is here. It's getting warmer. It's getting wetter in Vermont. It's a really complex issue, but we can start to understand it and think about how to mitigate and adapt.